Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Ensuring Quality and Risk Mitigation in Proactive Planning in Clinical Trials. My name is Christy McDonald, and I'm the Vice President of Client Delivery at the Avoca Group, and I have the privilege today of presenting with colleagues from both ZS Associates and Oracle. Jonathan, would you like to take the opportunity to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Chrissy. So I'm Jonathan Rowe. I'm an associate principal with ZS Associates, working within our R&D excellence practice. I've been involved in the industry since 1996, with about 15 years of that in large pharma and the rest being in startup and venture-backed pharma. My previous role prior to joining ZS Associates, I was the head of clinical development, quality performance, and risk management at Pfizer, where I focused most of my time on ensuring ICH-E6 R2 and GCP compliance, as well as building the risk management platform across portfolio, process, and vendor for all of our trials.
Excellent.
Thank
and
you.
Elvin?
Yeah, I've been in the industry even a little longer, since the early 80s. Oh, late 80s, not early, late 80s. And mainly in big pharma as a consultant, implementing CTMS clinical trial management systems. And that has then over time brought me into focusing more on the study startup phase. And by doing that, I ended up at Gobalto. That sort of went into the green space of doing that. And we got bought up by Oracle a good year ago, which now we are very active in this space, and I'm very happy to join this.
Excellent. Thank you both. So before we begin, I'd like to give a little bit background about all of the organizations, specifically for me, Avoca, to give you a foundation for the information that we're going to share with you during today's discussion. The Avoca Group's been dedicated to improving quality and compliance in the clinical trial execution process for over 20 years. We do this by helping companies develop and implement quality and compliance standards throughout their organization. So whether through consulting, online learning, or membership in our consortium, as well as the diligent vendor qualification platform, or speaking at events or webinars like today, our mission is actually to help companies increase quality, ensure compliance, and improve efficiency so that medicines can reach patients faster. The Avoca Quality Consortium is an industry collaborative. It was established in 2011 with the shared objective of elevating clinical trial quality and ultimately bringing all the key stakeholders in the clinical trial process into greater alignment in an attempt to decrease the silos that occur in organizations. So shown here are the names and logos of current member companies. There's about 115 in total. One of the benefits of membership is that you obtain company-wide access to an online knowledge center, which contains leading practices, guidelines, templates, and other fit-for-purpose tools. If you do happen to see your company's name on this slide but don't know how to access the knowledge center, feel free to reach out to us. Or if you don't see your company's name and you want to learn more about membership, again, please feel to reach out to us after today's webinar. Elvin, can you give us some information about Oracle?
Yeah, Oracle, of course, also have been around for many years, originally mainly databases, but they, several decades ago, also started focusing on pharma as they are supporting big industries, and pharma is one of them. And they have a big presence throughout the whole study lifecycle with all the product line. And what have happened is now in the future, where you have to own the problem to understand implementing analytics and machine learning. You literally have to go in and understand the problem, which is also why we are very pleased here to be collaborating with Avoca and see as an effort. So this is the core reasons why we are here.
Excellent. Thanks, Elvin. And last but not least, Jonathan, can you give us some background and information about ZS Associates?
Sure. ZS Associates has been around since about the early to mid 80s, and has grown over the years to more than 7,000 employees. And ZS is a consulting firm across a number of verticals. The area that I'm in, being R&D excellence, has over 650 professionals that we work with. We've invested over $40 million in R&D. And as you can see in the big picture in the middle, we cover everything in our practice from the bench all the way out to medical affairs, real-world data, health outcomes and economics research, clinical trials, and so on. So it's really an end-to-end solution we can provide for everything having to do with clinical trials, execution, and bringing those out into the real world.
That's excellent. Thanks, Jonathan. So today, our goal as a collective group here is to focus on the impetus of ICH E6R2 and ultimately what risk management looks like at both a system or organization level and at the trial level. And lastly, how risk management in particular can help in the study startup process. Just to go over some logistics, if at any time you have questions, please feel free to enter those into your WebEx application. We'll be pausing to address those questions throughout our time today. If we do not answer your question, we'll do our best to address those, and after the webinar is completed today, we'll send out a completed question and answer document for people to review. So the first thing that we wanted to talk about today is ultimately why was ICH E6R2 revised? So we're going to pause at this point just to take some time to ask a polling question. So for those of you on the line today, why did ICH implement E6R2? Was it to create stricter GCP rules for the industry, to extend the scope of GCP, or to encourage the implementation of improved approaches? So take your time right now and select one answer, and we'll review the responses. So, Mike, if you want to close that, since that was really just a test question to make sure everybody's awake here, let's take a glance at what those responses were. It'll take a moment for those to tally on the screen up here. So we will see. Looks like there it is. So it was actually, we'll go back to those response questions there, but it appears that we had most people select to encourage the implementation of improved approaches. And so with that, that is pretty accurate. So what has changed? The main change that occurred with R2 was ultimately to encourage the use of risk-based approaches and technology. So when ICH E6 was first prepared, clinical trials were performed mainly on paper processes, with the quote-unquote technology being used was a fax machine. So advances in EDC facilitated the implementation of other approaches, such as risk-based monitoring, centralized monitoring, and many other efficiency-enhancing activities. So as the scale, complexity, and cost of clinical trials increases, and the ability to utilize these technologies to collect and analyze data, risk management effectively offers new opportunities to focus on relevant activities and to minimize the focus on work that does not matter in terms of how it impacts patient safety, data integrity, or the impact of study endpoints. And that's ultimately what the ICH E6R2 guideline was focusing on. So the question is, has the objective changed? And the answer is really no. So while the amendment focuses on utilizing those risk-based approaches and technologies, the objective is still the same. The goal is to ensure that the rights, safety, and well-being of trial participants are protected and that the clinical trial data is in fact credible. So if we move forward, we can talk about some of the key important changes of R2. So the first is that it notes that for these electronic systems that they're now encouraging use of, there needs to be validation and quality control through qualified users and SOPs covering all the way from system setup, installation, and ultimately use. There were some serious breach updates that noted that regulators should be informed of any serious breaches where warranted by the local authorities when the noncompliance was a serious breach of protocol or GCP. In terms of essential records, the key is the additional C that was added to the previous ALCOA. So now we're looking to have essential documents that are not only attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, and accurate, but now there's the addition of complete. Some of the processes that we've been looking at, the process documents, are now going to become essential documents, things like your risk management plan. Risk reviews that are done require traceability of decision making. There's also an onus or a focus on documenting how risk management oversight is exercised and the outcome of any centralized monitoring with the actions that were taken as a result. The monitoring activities need to be traceable and documented. And lastly, there needs to be an end of trial report on the effectiveness of that risk management process that was implemented. If we look at a couple of the other things that were changed, there was a focus in R2 on risk-based strategies, but also on quality by the design and the minimization of risk through planning, the use of data and pre-established quality tolerance limits for decision-making, and ultimately the routine execution of risk reviews and investigation of root causes that are of emergent problems as part of the corrective action process. For risk-based strategies, the guidance asks that we provide oversight commensurate with the risks that matter and document the rationale for those chosen strategies. The expectation is that organizations implement a responsive and dynamic system of oversight versus a firefighting static system of oversight that we traditionally saw across the industry. And the guidance indicates that these risk-based monitoring, oversight, inspection, preparedness approaches can only succeed if the organization has a well-established and appropriately sized quality management system in place. So lastly, the guidance explicitly calls out that the sponsor and the investigator retain accountability for the quality regardless of the type of outsourcing model that they might employ. So if we focus today specifically on the risk management piece, from a regulatory perspective, risk management has existed in the pharmaceutical industry for a long time. However, it was often exclusively applied to the GMP space. So the regulatory agencies are now asking that this risk management and quality by design approaches that are frequently used in GMP are implemented across the GCP space.
So, Christy, I'd like to just, add on to that.
Absolutely.
So regarding, the GMP approach, I'm sure many of you are struggling because with GMP, you're dealing frequently with machines and so on. And it's one thing to have a risk management to understand that if the temperature of a tableting machine dye reaches a certain level that you might have sticking or something like that. And in GCP, we're dealing with people and not necessarily the temperature of the people and them reaching, something that could damage the tablet. And people are hard to predict. And so these are the kinds of things that we need to go to an industry is how do we build models that can predict risk so we're not reacting all the time to issues, and that can be done. So it's a little more challenging, but it can be done.
Yes, that's excellent, Jonathan. And I think these are some of the key components of risk management. So risk management is actually a combination of all of these coordinated activities and a control that an organization is going to put in place in regards to those risks. So the first step is really risk identification, and that's the systematic use of information to identify the sources of harm, referring to the risk or the problem in question. So for us, that would be a clinical trial. We need to identify the sources of harm that can be caused or the risks associated with patient safety and data integrity. The risk assessment is a systematic process of organizing that information to support a risk decision to be made within a risk management process. The risk analysis piece is actually the estimation of the risk associated with the hazard. And then the risk evaluation is comparison of the estimated risk to the given risk criteria using a quantitative or a qualitative scale to determine the significance of that risk. And so the guidance points to understanding the detectability of that risk, the probability of that risk occurring, and ultimately the severity or the impact of that risk. Once those pieces are done, you move to the risk reduction process, which are really the actions taken to lessen the probability of the occurrence of that risk happening or the severity of that harm. The other important part to think about is that ultimately there's risk acceptance, which is the informed decision that an organization might take in regard to a particular risk. So an enterprise and an organization can choose to either accept a risk based on their risk appetite, their risk attitude, or ultimately their risk tolerance. So while we can go through this process and we can identify risks, there may be some that we choose to just accept and not ultimately put mitigation processes or procedures in place.
And Christy, with this, one of the things that sometimes can be confusing is there seems to be this line that falls from evaluation into reduction or acceptance. Once you evaluate, you can go either way. It doesn't have to go through reduction. So a company will set its threshold once you do the evaluation, and you can come up with a risk priority number by doing an FMEA and just say, yeah, that's below our threshold. If you capture that in your SOPs, you can explain it to the regulators why you said something like that we're just going to accept.
Yeah. And I think that's key. So part of that R2 requirement is going through that process, and then the importance of documenting those decisions as well to be able to go back to those regulators. So now that we've talked through some of the requirements of ICH E6R2 in terms of technology and risk management, some of you are here, I'm sure, because there's still some internal struggle within your organization to implement those items in R2. So for your company, what has been the most significant challenge in terms of becoming ICH E6R2 compliant? Is it resources? Is it manpower? Is it the change management aspect and moving from that proactive versus reactive focus? Is it a low tolerance for risk, or some other methodology? And if it's some other, please feel free to denote that in the Q&A as a comment, and we would love to check that out. About 10 more seconds to put in your response there. About 2 more seconds. So Mike, if you want to close that poll, while we're getting the responses to that poll, something interesting to look at is that uniquely, Avoca has asked this same question at our industry conference, and on this, you'll see a list of some verbatim responses that we received in terms of organizations' challenges in becoming ICH E6R2 compliant. And some of the highlights that you'll see here are the manpower to adjust those SOPs and having those resources. How to implement QTLs is an issue. How to communicate the importance of the requirements to all levels within the organization, and ultimately the culture shifts associated with that, and really a low tolerance for risk. So this is a really interesting list that we compiled through some of our members at a in-person meeting where we were able to talk about what some of those challenges are. And if you look at the responses that we have here today, they're all pretty similarly split across the board. So it looks like resourcing and finding the people to get, I imagine, updates to SOPs and whatnot done is first. There's also the organizational change management component, and then understanding the requirements are all pretty darn close to one another. So hopefully some of our discussions today will help your organization really take a step forward in moving towards some risk-based approaches in a tangible way. But with that, I'm actually going to pass it over to Jonathan to speak about what risk management looks like at a system and a trial level. So Jonathan, I'll just control your slides, but if you want to take it away.
Okay. So as many of you are probably aware, in ICH E6, there's the commentary on the left side, which says that the sponsor should identify risks critical to trial processes and data. And you need to consider these. We need to consider these at the system level and at the clinical trial level. And, you know, if you think about what is a system level and what is a trial level risk, when I think about trial level risk, it's everything that emanates from the protocol. And with the protocol, the requirement really should be either you do a RACT type tool, so a risk assessment categorization tool. More advanced, you do an integrated quality management plan. And the type of information that comes out of the protocol helps you build further on for your trial risk processes. So at the trial level, you have the protocol and then you have the execution. Much of that is also at the site level. At the system level, we think about vendors and the processes across all your trials and your QMS. So if you're a company that's running a number of trials, you may have multiple vendors and they may go across the trials. All of your processes run across your trials. And so again, it's important to understand your risks to your studies, your processes, your vendors, and break them down into, hey, this is trial and this is system. Next slide. Now this really horrible diagram I put together actually should make a lot of sense. When you think about starting at the study level and doing an integrated quality management plan, from there you can sit back and think about what processes are touching your study, what vendors are touching your study, what are my risks to critical data as a requirement, and developing from there also the requirement for your QTLs. Now, quality tolerance limits, I've done some presentations on this in the past, are really the highest level things that if they go wrong could severely impact the ability to draw conclusions from the data or severely impact patient safety. There should only be a few of these things you consider to be QTLs. And the reason why impacting the ability to draw conclusions from a data is so important is that if you go through your trial and at the end you lose power in the trial and you can't draw a conclusion, then a whole bunch of people were enrolled in a study where they received an investigational product, where they've given blood samples, where they've gone to meetings with their physicians, and in the end it was for no good reason. So it's really very high level. So you establish those potential risks. And then also from the IQMP, if you identify critical processes and data, those are things that can be put into your monitoring plan. So for example, if a critical process has to do with informed consent, maybe you're doing a pediatric trial and you're very concerned that the guardian hasn't signed it, that can be built into, all right, so these are the things we're going to monitor, and that could be in your RBM activities. So you can develop your KRIs from doing your risk management plan as well. The reason why these lines go the way they do is, as per the guidelines, QTLs need to be reported in the CSR. So that's a constant, not only through the execution of the trial, but also when you get to the CSR. And the KRIs are things that you basically focus on during the execution of the trial, and they don't have to go into the CSR. Okay, next slide. So the other area when we think about identifying critical processes is there are a lot of processes to consider. And, as you see on the top right, it says that the sponsor should identify those processes and data that are critical to ensure human subject protection and the reliability of results. When you think across the kinds of processes that might be going on in clinical trial execution, there are a lot of them. Protocol design is a process, site selection is a process, issue management is a process, SAE reporting and SUSAR reporting is a process, how you close out a site is a process. there is no guidance to tell us which one is critical. So the regulators don't say, hey, the following are critical. That's entirely up to the teams to decide, or even at the enterprise level to decide which one of these processes are critical, and then ensure that there's risk management plans in place. And they will be different from study to study. You may be taking on a novel way of doing a study, maybe using new technology, and that has an endpoint that's very important. So maybe the process of collecting that data from that new wearable might be something critical. So it really does depend. And it's up to you to decide. As long as you document it, you'll be okay. Next slide. What I wanted to show you is that clinical trial risk management is effective. And I'll tell you the story behind this slide deck. What the dots represent on the size are the number of clinical trials that identified a risk. And the numbers on the left identify what the risk priority number was from looking at probability, detectability, and severity. And this is at an enterprise level for a large pharma company. The top one, where the risk identified was that the subject might take prohibited concomitant medication, it had a high risk priority number of 300. And when that was identified as something that was going across the enterprise, steps were put in place in order to mitigate that risk. And as you can see, over time, that level of risk dropped down to what was an acceptable level of risk, which this company set as a number of 160. So you identify a risk, you can do something about it, and it can go down. The second risk was improper collecting, handling, or shipping of samples. And this one also was floating above the number of 160 for a very brief period of time. But when it hit a number of 140 around Q4 2017, it was an acceptable risk. So therefore, no more work was done. As you can see, the risk, stayed about the same. So there was no effort to reduce that risk. It was accepted. It stayed the same. And the final one was the data management risk, which also had a very high risk priority number, and that was extraordinarily important to tackle. And you can see, again, when it was identified at the enterprise level that many trials were concerned about that in this portfolio, work was done to mitigate it below that 160 threshold, where it no longer became a risk that needed to be mitigated. It suddenly became something that was accepted. So another good reason for doing risk management and upfront IQMPs and so on is you can identify areas across the enterprise where you might not have identified it on a trial-by-trial basis to look for risks at the system level, mitigate the system level, and then get things under control. Okay, I think that's my last slide.
Thank
That's
you,
great.
Jonathan.
No, thank you, Jonathan. So moving on to Elvin. Elvin, can you talk to us specifically about how risk management helps or is effective in the study startup phase?
Yeah, and first I'll just, this is part of Oracle, and this is always a safe harbor statement. I'll just let it stand there for a few seconds, but it's basically referring to anything I'm talking about here is not something Oracle promising delivering. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, so the first thing I would talk about here is just talk about what is study startup and how it has been defined. And it's actually something that was not really defined until 10 years ago. And at that point, it was mainly focusing on the study startup on the site level and then also on the country level. And could you just tap forward here for the next point? So the first piece here we see in blue is about identifying the site. So in this perspective here, we're talking about it's just identifying the site until the site has been given a study association. That's when it's been study ID'd, and then feasibility can start. Next one, please. The next one goes in about selecting the site. So this is where feasibility can occur, and when the site has been selected, it's also both been feasible for the study and you actually needed to meet your patient target for the study. And next one, please. And the final one is the activation. And this is where you actually ensuring the GCP and you have all the essential document that's needed. And when that's completed, then you're ready for enrollment. But this is the phase where, and why is that important? It's important because this is where you truly can risk mitigate. And I also think that specifically this area will evolve beyond what we're seeing here, where it's site-focused and it's country-focused. As Jonathan and even Chrissy earlier talked about, you have to do this at a study level. And I also truly believe this will move into higher level as the program looking across studies, because the risks are actually often the same for multiple studies, especially in phase 2 and 3 and even 4 within the same program. And next, please. And this is sort of also the story that you have time. So the good thing is you actually have decent amount of time to do this risk assessment and risk mitigation. And if you look at just the site level alone, from your first contacting a site to you actually activating it, you often have around 7 months to do it. So that's a decent amount of time to actually get it right in the beginning. Next one, please. Yeah, so this here is how does this actually align? The whole overall study life cycle, how does that align with what was introduced in ICH E6 and R2? Next one, please. So here are the components, and these are the individual sections that are in E6 R2. So that's the section, especially from 01 through 07, was truly introduced in R2, where the whole risk process was defined. And next one, please. So what I will then look at here is how does that align with the normal overall life cycle of a study, where you first have the study startup, the conduct, and then the closing. So next one, please. The first element is where do we define it? And so from these new elements that's introduced, most of these are actually already being touched directly in the study startup, because it's where you look at the critical processes and the data identification. You also then identify the risk, you evaluate them, and you put in risk controls so you can mitigate them, and then you have to communicate that out to all the organizations and parties that are involved in that process. Next one, please. And then in the conduct, you continue ongoingly to have these regular reviews where you'll touch the same points, but then you also have to go in and review these risks, do risk reporting when there's any risk identified, and then you overall monitor it, of course, and document when you're in non-compliance. And then next one, please. In the closeout, the main focus is on the final, in the CSR, when you do the final risk reporting that then have to be done. Okay, then next one, please. And here, how does this all then come together with the overall process? And next one. So the first one, and I will go through the cycles here, and this is first on the study level, where again we see the same segments I talked about, or sections from the E6R2, where we first in the design of the protocol, and as I talked about before, this would, in the future, I think they'll be more focused on actually on a higher level, on the program level, because these risks you'll be identifying will often be the same throughout the program. So it's better to do the risk assessment earlier, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, of course, in the study design. So you define your critical processes and you do your data modification in design, and then also you identify from that the risks. Next one, please. And on a study level, you go into the feasibility. As you're doing the feasibility of the study, you'll at the same time doing your risk evaluation. And next one, please. And while you're then truly then putting this study in place and getting it finalized, you put in your risk controls and you communicate that throughout your organization. And we will see this repeating now with, next one please, on the country level. So you'd also have, beyond you have risk on the study level, each time you're introducing a new country, there'll be additional risks that you have. So you'll go through the same steps on a country level, and often these will be regulatory in nature, but just the simple fact that you also will have, you'll have country reviews of your study, you will have additional potentially amendment. Next one, please. And these, based on this, you sometimes, of course, in the selection process also evaluate that when you're selecting it. And then next one, please. And then finally, you can start the GCP activation where there'll be your regulatory and IRB submission and reviews. And you communicate the risk to these countries and get it in place. That would also then go to the next one, please. And we'll see a repeat here on site level. Again, you identify the site, and this is the process we saw in the beginning, where you would have the same risk identification of individual sites, depending on, of course, how often have they done a study before. If they haven't done studies before, they'll inherently have risks throughout the process. Next one, please. Yeah, next one. Yeah, there we'll see the selection of the site where we'll do the evaluation. That's part of the normal feasibility, so nothing new. Actually, it's something that's already occurring. And then next one, please. And then, of course, you're activating, you're communicating out to the site, you do all your investigator meeting. So all this is something specifically on the country level and site level, something you have already done in part of selecting the country and the feasibility, and the same with the site. But now it's getting more formalized and also documented. And then specifically it goes into doing it higher in the process on the study level, and I think in the future on the program level. Next one, please. So yes, this risk process actually aligned with the existing study startup process. So it's not overall, it doesn't change it. So it's not a major impact from that point of view. But of course, there are overall impact. Next one, please. So with this here, we'll now have our next polling question. So can risk management help in study startup? So the first one is, yes, longer term risk management will significantly improve study startup. Or you have no risk management will be just another burden on running clinical trials. And then finally, overall risk management will not have a significant impact on running clinical trials. And we'll just give this here a few extra minutes. So just a few extra seconds, not minutes. I think that's a better term. Yeah, Michael, when you're ready, you can probably pull it up if you have enough. And I know this here takes a few seconds before it comes up. See what it is. I think longer term here, this, if we get them there, Michael.
There it goes.
Exactly. Okay, yeah. So it seems like people have done this before, because it's clearly in one side. Yes, longer term will actually significantly improve the overall process. And this is also the intent from ICH, but it doesn't come just easy, as we talked about earlier, with what the barriers are in implementing it, as Christy presented. But next one, please, here. And this here, it's a slide I wanted to just put in here because it actually also matters about the size of your company and what it takes to implement it. So who is actually applying it? And I know this one is an older study, but a lot of it is still true. So here it's looking at the top 20 sponsors compared to all other sponsors. and how they, the frequency of their risk assessment. And in this case, it's looked at depending on if it's done in-house or if it's done as a full service outsourced study, or if it's an FSP that's being done, so a functional service provider component. And you can see the sponsors, as a general, the top 20 sponsors overall do a decent amount of risk assessment, but where the smaller sponsors do it to a lesser degree. And some of it probably come into just the experience they have in doing it and the cost and the resource taken, or potentially if bigger sponsors are more risk averse. I think what is interesting here is when it's as a smaller sponsor, if you fully outsource it, at that point you tend to, even the smaller sponsors do in this case 55% risk assessment, and that's also where this is sort of what you truly own. You can't outsource your risk. That's something you own, and therefore it's being done. I don't know, Jonathan, if you have any comment to this one, or even Chrissy. If not, then I'll just move on to the next one. Next one, please. Yeah, so here, this is sort of the final slide in this process. So how can this be implemented, and what are the challenges and opportunities in implementing it from an overall process in a study startup? So next one. So first here we'll look at the challenges and what, especially in short term, they are. Next one. So first, you need to have investment of both your resources but also capital in getting this done. So there will be cost up front, both to your normal headcount and the additional work they have to do. But next one, please. But then there would also, how do you actually gain all the knowledge that is needed to do this? So you have to have this skill set set up and built into your organization to do this risk assessment. Because it's something, of course, you're not necessarily, unless you're getting used to it, it'll take time to build up a process for doing that. And there are consultancies out there, as Jonathan, of course, can refer to, how they can help to set that up. And also from Avoca, that their whole expertise in the background and all the documentation they have in consultancyship. And then the whole aspect of identifying that throughout your trial and even on a program level. Next one, please. And then you need to build up data and expertise in doing that. I don't know, what's that comment?
Yeah, so it's Jonathan. I just wanted to say that regarding the investment of resources, I've been involved in a pretty big study that says you can really get good upfront risk management done for a trial with about 50 to 60 hours of FTE time, and that includes, assuming that there are 8 to 10 people on your study management team, them putting in about 5 hours worth of work. And that can be everyone sitting around a table one afternoon and getting it done. So it's not a tremendous investment, but it pays back dividends when you actually do it.
Yeah, and in that, is that from when you have the experience and when you have built up the process, that's when it's sort of optimized, that it takes that resources?
Yeah, and it helps if you have someone who's good at facilitating it.
Yeah, I'm sure that's a key element in the beginning especially. But even, I think when you're executing the study afterwards, that the study team are just used to running their trial, but it's good to have a separate risk resource that can help to do the regular review and even in the beginning the setup. Next one, please. Yeah, and then this also requires coordination, and I think this is a challenge, especially when these systems in the past and the processes that have been in place often have been a sort of a one-size-fits-all, where departments individually, both the safety, the data, the clinical operations, they're used to running on their own based on their existing processes. But now when risk is introduced, this has to be communicated and reacted to per study that they do, so that it adds additional communication, which also requires better system integration and system coordination, where system in the past often existed on their own. The future of digital technical systems will also require that they can communicate between them and not be standalone. Next one, please. Yeah, and it will initially require additional time, and they will be spent in the study startup. But then we'll go in and look at the opportunities we also have here in the long run. So it'll give you, so you actually get better designed protocols, and it will also focus more on the quality information. So with your risk score, so you get focused on what is important. And as Jonathan referred to earlier, you have clear focus on a very few individual ones. Next one, please. One more, please. Yeah. And it's applied with standards and advanced technology. And this will result and can result in a study process which actually better in place to protect the patient and also ensure the credibility of the data. Next one, please. Which are important because that's the objective of the ICH in the first place. And it will also lower the number of protocol amendments when you really control it from the beginning, because you actually manage it up front. Next one, please. And then finally here, it actually overall will optimize the study startup and shorten the cycle time in the long run. And then I think next one, please, which are basically a takeaway slide here before we go to Q&A. Next one, please. So upfront cost will be, there will be upfront cost, and it will also be initially when you set up the processes, it will take extra time, but that can be minimal, as Jonathan referred to, over time. Next one. But it's something you're already doing in many parts of your process. It just gets more formalized for the study and overall. So we're already seeing it that you are utilizing these processes, but we are then extending these to these regulatory assessment, and that need to be built into the documentation that need to be captured and stored in your TMF. But I think that if you're new to it, it's important to start small, just to focus on what is truly critical, as Jonathan referred to, so you don't confuse the change management as it goes into place. Next one, please. But longer term, this can definitely bring a significant benefit to the whole process, and it gives you time to mitigate before you and you have time, as we saw earlier, and before you actually do the study startup. But over time, it's then important you implement technology standards, and you start scaling this risk management throughout the process, and then it will also provide significant operational benefit. And then I think we go into the Q&A section here. So thank you for now.
Yes, absolutely. At this point, I'm going to look at some of the Q&A. Jonathan, there was one that you had answered, I think, privately throughout the Q&A that I actually think is worth sharing with the group. So there was a question about what if the risk occurs? How do you pre-allocate resources to mitigate it? And then ultimately, should all of those risks be eliminated? We touched on the should all risks be eliminated piece, but I don't know if you want to sort of answer it again more directly with the resources component as well.
Yeah, so if a risk occurs, it becomes an issue, right? And so issue management is a key component of your GCP QMS. So dealing with, the issue is something that has to be addressed, and you probably have to have it in some report that's inspectable and so on. So then the question becomes, how do you make sure that the issue doesn't happen again? So what's the risk of that issue happening again? By taking, the failure mode effects approach, in other words, the probability, the detectability, and the severity, you can develop a score that will give you a value that your company will set a threshold for what they will be willing to mitigate and not. And really it comes down to what is your tolerance. It's not going to be that all risks have to be eliminated, but risks above a certain measurable threshold will have to be, and that's a company-by-company basis. You know, I would never push anybody towards elimination of all risk. It's too much effort, especially if something's not likely to happen, and you can detect it, and it's not very severe.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Another question that actually just came in was related to Alvin's last point, and it was asking whether or not risk management can or will effectively lower the protocol amendments. And so tied with that question was the when at study startup are you suggesting the risk management exercise be done? So I can speak that across the industry, it's best practice to actually begin the risk management and the risk identification process during protocol development, so prior to protocol finalization. Oftentimes we see it done before the protocol goes for final approval because it will help you identify your QTLs. It will help you potentially make changes in the protocol that are needed. Jonathan, I don't know if you have alternative information from your experience at Pfizer, but that is sort of what we see as best practice across the industry at Avoca.
Yeah, that's correct. During protocol development, in fact, it aligns well with ICH, which says that you should be reducing complexity, risks to patients, and so on. That would all be done during protocol development.
Yep.
Yeah, just a comment to the amendment portion itself. I think it's an interesting thing because we, in the National Cancer Institute, are also starting the example of that. The more reviews you literally have, of course, indirectly, the more eyes you have to see it, the more comments you will have that indirectly just force small amendment. And it's not just on a country basis it's seen, it's also seen from, especially in the US, where there's local IRBs, and which are one of the reasons why the National Cancer Institute don't want to fund studies these days necessarily if they don't accept the central IRB, because the whole review process gets longer. And necessarily more chief doesn't necessarily meaning people looking at it make a better protocol, but it will indirectly lead to more review and more amendments that even if they're small. So that's sort of the overall that will bring risk to it. And that goes on a country level too. So that's something we see and focus on in trying to optimize the whole study startup process.
Yes, agreed.
So upfront risk management does reduce the defect rate in protocols. If you're going to scope, I'll be presenting on that. It absolutely does work. So I have that presentation.
I'll be there and listen to you.
All right.
Yes, I was going to agree. So, you know, part of quality by design and ultimately the new revision in E8 as well focuses on the key of doing an appropriate risk management is ensuring that you have the appropriate people conducting the risk assessment. And the updated E8 suggests ensuring that sites are part of this and investigators and ultimately sometimes patients as well. So if you look at an example of doing a risk assessment with, you know, say it is an oncology study that's looking for a PK time point at 12 hours, and then you find out that, well, there's really no academic center who has a lab open to process that PK sample at 12 hours, you're now dealing with a bunch of protocol deviations that you ultimately have to do an amendment for because really the appropriate people weren't part of your risk assessment in the beginning to identify some of those risks. So I think that's an example of something that could potentially decrease an amendment piece. That being said, there are a couple of questions that says, I'm sorry, was that you, Elvin? Okay. Jonathan, another question that you addressed that I think is worth bringing forward to the group is there was a question asked about whether the vendor oversight plan should include your risk mitigation strategy for each vendor or if there's a separate risk mitigation plan for the program and study level.
Yeah. So first off, many companies have a lot of vendors, so I'd first start with what your critical vendors are. for a risk management plan. So there should be a risk management plan for your vendors. But the question becomes, does vendor risk management drive your study risk, or does study risk drive your vendor risk? And it's both ways. So an example can be, let's say you've got a large portfolio, or maybe you're running 50 studies, and through upfront risk management of your protocols, it turns out that many of your protocols identify that monitoring is a critical risk, and they all happen to be identifying the same vendor. So that would be a message at the enterprise level to say, hey, why do 30% of our trials really have a high risk for monitoring from the same vendor? So then you might want to have a risk management plan for that vendor overall. And conversely, at the vendor level, you might have a scenario where your vendor is getting acquired, and that's going to lead to staff turnover and other things. So you may want to push that down to the teams to say you now have a risk of turnover of the people you're working with, so you might want to mitigate that. So it does go both ways. Ultimately, what you want to be able to do is something I call the clue game. You know, the clue game, which is Colonel Mustard in the conservatory with the candlestick, where you want to know it's this study with that vendor using this process is ultimately your highest risk, and you can do that by appropriate upfront risk management.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think we might have time for one, maybe two more. There was a question that came in asking if regulatory agencies have cited lack of risk assessment and mitigation in inspections. And so one of the areas that Avoca focuses on is actually collecting inspection experiences through our member organizations. And we can very confidently state that we have seen these as findings, not only at the study level, but also organizationally as a chronic issue, which resulted in corrective actions being put in place to show that they are in compliance to that regulatory agency because of a lack of overall risk assessment planning throughout a study. So Jonathan, I don't know if you've heard anything, or Elvin, that conflicts with that information, but we have certainly seen those as findings across the industry.
Yeah, I'll tell you just a quick funny story. About a year and a half ago during an inspection, there was an issue that happened, and the regulator asked, did you identify that risk? And I was really excited because this was my area. And we said yes, and they said, okay. And that was the end of it. I was like, oh, that's, you know, I was really waiting for a big dig in to the system. But, you know, since then, I have been hearing stories where they do want to know that the upfront work was done.
I have some other examples that sort of nearly the opposite, where the regulatory agencies are not actually always themselves ready to take on risk assessment in studies. So in a case where you have decided not to do the full SDV, so your full source documentation verification, that and therefore, but the FDA go in and give 483 freeze simply for them not being there. Even that's part of the risk assessment, and that it generally contributed to that the regulatory agencies don't, like the FDA, don't have the resources yet to train their people. So I think that's some of the things that need to come into place, that they are not even in that case ready to act on it always.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, I just want to remind everyone that we are very grateful for your questions, and we will take some time offline to address them if we did not get to them today. But I want to thank everyone for coming. We know how hard it is to take some dedicated time away from your day-to-day activities. So we greatly appreciate you joining us for this discussion today, and we hope you took something away with you that makes your job a bit easier tomorrow. So thanks again, and have a great day and a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.